question migratoire, la question des migrants.
So the migratory challenge, we know that this is a delicate issue during this particular period in particular. It has highlighted, in fact, this difficult period due to the war in the Ukraine, of course, the issue of migrants, but it's a topic that has concerned us for the last few decades, but perhaps more than ever today. Monsieur Carême, the member of the European Parliament who is with us, is probably the first person I would like to speak to and address my question for particular reasons, because this is a topic that concerns or not the European Union. It is true that one of the major topics during COVID, before COVID, during the migratory crisis in 2015, the Dublin Treaty, we're talking about very specific territories that come under difficulties. And as a member of the European Parliament, I would like to know how you perceive this issue, the stress perhaps that exists for nations welcoming these migrants. So what is your view on this? Well, first of all, good afternoon. Well, yes, of course, the European Union has a very important role to play, in fact, a leading role. I wouldn't say there's any particular stress related to the question. There is no crisis. There's simply the arrival of people who've been exiled from their own countries, as always throughout history. Currently, we've welcomed 4 million Ukrainians in Europe, and that has not been at all a problem. Of course, there were a few issues in November of last year on the border between Belarus and Poland, and we talked about a hybrid war at a European level. But it is a European issue, certainly, because Europe has decided to set up joint agencies, the Frontex agency to protect its external borders, various regulations and directives, the Dublin rules in particular. And we have to say that it's been a failure. It's always been a failure. And we saw this in the European Parliament recently, because we don't have the power to propose legislation, but via the European Commission, we have been asked to look at the Dublin rules, the rule by which the first country of arrival has to look at the request for asylum. And of course, the fact that in Greece, in Italy and in Spain, we have the arrival of significant numbers of migrants that are too great in numbers in order to be able to manage these migrants. 2 years ago, I went to Samos in Greece, and in an area which could only hold 600 people, 6,000 people were present. And also we talk about illegal immigrants because, of course, these people, when they arrive in Europe, they didn't ask for a visa at their embassy in Greece because of a war situation. And I've seen, for example, Syrian Kurds who just arrived because Turkey had bombed Kurdish Syria, and that had arrived in Greece, and they'd asked for a meeting to ask for asylum. This was in October 2019, and it's only in February 2021 that they were able to meet the officials in question just to look at their asylum request. And of course, there is a period of appeal if the request is rejected. And so this means that for over 18 months, these people have no answer and they can't do anything. They can't move. They have no access to food, to health services. They don't have access to a minimum which every human being deserves. And that's why I say that Europe has completely failed. And when this initiative report was adopted a few months ago, the European Parliament looked at it before the Commission presented its new asylum report, which is the Dublin rules recast, but which didn't change the rules in terms of the first country of arrival that needs to look at the request for asylum. And so the crises will continue. And this has led to over 3,000 deaths in the Mediterranean in 2021, so a greater number than 2020. And there are even people dying in the English Channel because they're trying to cross over into Britain. And we can see that the reinforcement of borders and guards at the borders, first of all, this doesn't stop people from arriving because those people try and get around those problems, and also they take increasing risks. And from a humanitarian point of view, I would say that Europe has failed. It refuses to organize humanitarian corridors. And as the International Organization for Migration has said, I would like to remind us that 80% of migration happens in surrounding countries. And those surrounding countries at some point have bottlenecks. They can no longer welcome and settle the number of people arriving. And unfortunately, of course, we know what happened in Afghanistan. Many Afghans went to Tajikistan and Iran and surrounding countries and surrounding Afghanistan. We have taken in Europe very few Afghans since August of last year. And as a member of the European Parliament, there are lawyers, of course, that we know that have been attacked by the Taliban, and they have a lack of financial resources, and there's nothing that we've done. Of course, for the Ukraine, it was different. We had a directive which wasn't actually implemented in 2015 with the Syrian conflict, but it has now to enable Ukrainians to come to Europe and benefit from certain rights in our country. So Europe certainly has to do better. And it is very complex, of course, and negotiations are ongoing on the regulations. We're not moving forward very much, and I'm the ecological representative on this. We've had several meetings, and for the time being, we're not moving forward, unfortunately. States are withdrawing within themselves, so we're losing our European values in that sense. We're too inward looking. You know, calls for solidarity are somewhat forgotten, but today figures actually show us that if you look at the number of people in some countries, if you take into account the difference between the birth rate and the death rate, it's actually migrants that enable them to sustain their population. And we always talk about this as if it was a problem, but if we put the resources in place that are necessary, it would no longer be a problem. And I blame several managers coming back from Afghanistan, for example. They say we have to confront irregular migratory flows. And coming back from the Ukraine, they say that we need to welcome these people. So the rhetoric is different. And in fact, whether it's Afghanistan or the Ukraine, we're talking about people who've actually suffered through war. So I would say that it's actually scandalous that they're treated differently, and that there are governments that hold the current rhetoric in many cases. And we coming out in France, of course, from the presidential elections and the legislative elections, and migration has been an issue, of course. And you can see the results: 89% who voted against migration, and that wasn't the case in Germany. Of course, during the national results, the extreme right saw its results much lower. So I think there are lessons to be learned from this. And also, as former mayor of Grenoble, I can speak of my own experience that even if you explain to people that it's a good idea to welcome these migrants, it enables us to fight against xenophobia. No, of course, I was talking about a stress in territories, perhaps for those territories that don't have the necessary setup to welcome such a flow of people. If we take into account the high number of migrants, we don't have the institutions or the services that would enable us to manage the situation. This is what I was referring to. But it's interesting what you say. The difference that we make between, let's say, Afghan migrants compared to Ukrainian migrants, and the very different policies adopted in Europe in relation to these two migratory flows. And it seems that we make a distinction between economic issues, climatic issues, pandemic, and wars or not wars. So it's very disparate as a topic. And of course, we are trying to analyze the issue. We are trying to understand in order to be able to act as best as we can. And this brings me to Mr. Szydarowski, who is the Espon EGTC director. Thank you for being here. And I can't help because I am myself a user of Espon data, as many of my colleagues. I can't help from the point of view of Brussels. How do you see this? This particular phenomenon, after Mr. Carême has spoken, do you see it as a stress, this migratory challenge? So how is this particular problem seen from Brussels? Well, yes, of course, we could say that the EU is not doing anything, but in Brussels, is Espon not trying to do something? Do you not have any data on this particular topic? Do you see things differently? I would like to have your view on this.
Thank you very much indeed. I'll speak in English. Hopefully it's okay. Espon, as you know, is not based in Brussels. We are based in Luxembourg. That was also referred to many times before, which also is an interesting laboratory in itself. Luxembourg, as we heard before, is also the place where the dynamics is really high. So even though we are a pan-European program, we can experiment on the living body, what it means actually with the growing number of people that come and go, how to accommodate the different needs, how to accommodate also the different perspectives, because people come from all over the world. And what we do in Espon is we are not setting any policies, because this is not our mandate. The role of Espon is, I phrase it myself, as to connect, inspire, and show new horizons. Connecting researchers, policymakers, and practitioners. Learning by good examples, and also trying to understand that what is going on is going to bring a lot of impact on my policy making, so I need to be prepared. Inspire means that there might be some new things that I can bring from taking part in the network that we are offering, or the organizations that are hosts of this event have been offering. This is also the way to be part of the network, to learn from good practices, because the crises will come again. So there will be a next refugee crisis, definitely. There will be a new climate crisis, new energy crisis. We need to know how to, not to prevent it from happening, because we can't prevent it, but how to prepare ourselves when it comes, so that we know what to do. And show new horizons, in my view, is how we can do the things in a different way, how we can bounce back from the crisis that we are having now to do things in a different way, in a better way. And in particular, what is also the melody for my ears, what is the motto of Espon, doing not for the people, for the citizens, but with the citizens. So this is also how we could probably draw lessons from the current crisis, where we have a lot of migrants in many of the countries. How we can also involve the citizen groups, the residents that have been so perfectly showing what the solidarity means in mastering the future crisis. Because this is important, that we do it with the people and not for the people, only complaining about the limited capacity that we have at administrative levels, that we don't know what the national authorities should do, what the regions should do, what the local authorities should do. But this extreme potential lies with the people, and the authorities need to exploit it together with them in the right manner.
Très intéressant le fait que, merci beaucoup d'ailleurs, le fait que vous parlez justement de...
Well, thank you for this. And it's very interesting that you talk about the need to aspire learning by doing. In fact, and I was also interested by the fact that you speak almost like someone who advocates international cooperation. They no longer talk about acting on behalf of people, but with the people. And you're saying the same thing. And it's quite interesting that you mentioned this, that we need to work to intervene. It's not about policy making. That's not what it's about, but you are the instrument that could be useful. And this is something that is extremely interesting, because we're talking about measures, about tools. And you highlight the fact that there are principles, of course, that sustain the will to act, and that is very specific. But I'd like to frame this within the context of the territories that we're talking about, cross-border territories. And it would be interesting to take as our starting point something that's not that far, because we have a Franco-Spanish border, and that's why I'm delighted to have with us María Ángeles Elorza Zubiría, because as a representative of your municipality at international level, you have signed an agreement with the other side of the border in terms of welcoming migrants, and you wished to set up a cross-border agreement on migrants. And yet we always think that migratory flows are to be dealt with at national level at times of crisis. And yet you have been able to sign something locally. Can you tell us a little bit more about this? Absolutely. First of all, hello. And I wish to highlight, first of all, that the migratory issue, I would say, involves all levels of government, the state, uh, European Union, national governments, regional, local governments, because it's a phenomenon that's happening in our municipalities. They are our neighbors. So it is up to us also to provide an answer to help to integrate people who are coming to live in our areas. In the Basque country, we welcome migrants who need protection or unaccompanied minors whose destination is the Basque country and that stay in our region for a while or for life. But also as a cross-border territory, we have also migrants that are in transit. They are going somewhere, so they're not stopping in the Basque country. It's only a stopover. And these people, when they arrive, they are very often distressed, very often after very long voyages that started several months or even years sometimes before. Often they arrive exhausted physically and mentally. We have pregnant women, people who are traveling with children. And we decided as a government and as a society, I would say, that we need to reduce the suffering of these people and the risks incurred by these people, and to try to help them and deal with them with dignity. And thankfully, our neighbors in the country Basque think the same thing. So we have on the other side of the border. So we've approved a joint declaration in March of this year. First of all, to express our commitments, our humanitarian commitments towards these people who have natural rights, and also to highlight our will to act in order to help these people with dignity. These people are already in very distressed situations, because also these people who might be with us for a few days, a few weeks, who are in transit, as I said, who wish to move on across the border, when those people move across the border, well, they'll be in the next municipality on the other side of the border in the Basque country. But we have set up a mechanism that enables us to welcome 550 people in transit. It is a mechanism funded 100% by Basque institutions, strengthening the mechanisms provided by the states. We also have set up an institutional commission that's at every level, plus the social sector, working with migrants and people who need particular protection. Together, we have designated contingency plans, emergency plans, in order to be able to face increased migratory flows. And very recently, we invited within the community in the Basque country, we met up as a commission. We invited them to work with the commission, because the people who come to us in the centers we have in Irun at some point will arrive in Bayonne, in the French Basque country. So we share information, we work together, we try to resolve issues and plan together how to face very difficult moments and when there are increases in migratory flows. Because unfortunately, we had to remind people that 9 people died, in fact, this weekend by trying to cross the river that separates France and Spain.
Thank you very much, because here, borders are opportunities. You work with colleagues on the other side of the border, and you pay to manage your own problems. I'm thinking about the Italian border, where the opinion is to keep them on your side. So this is different within Europe or outside Europe. We need to consider this differently. But once again, I think to give you the example of the intelligence of a cross-border area to identify and respond to a specific need, which is interesting. Following that, there is the new European vision, a new opportunity, actions, and possibilities. So the vision of a local territory. I would like to hear now somebody who's been working in this area for several years, in fact, a couple of decades, Mrs. Béatrice Godefroy, you are in the field, perhaps not directly in the field, but you identify questions which start in one area before moving on to another. And this vision would be interesting now that you have heard our three speakers. What can you say to respond to this? What could you say as somebody who works in this area, who has to manage elements perhaps differently from somebody who is managing a local area or a member of the European Parliament, or somebody who is responsible for considering how to respond? Hello, yes, thank you for the invitation. I am going to give you the point of view of somebody who does not, in fact, work in the field, but in conflict areas themselves. I work in particular, for the last 4 years, I've been working in Ukraine, and clearly recent months have been very intense. What I can hear on this panel echoes what I have experienced despite the distance. I would like to thank you for the way you have articulated European migration policy, but also the fact that you have underlined the humanity of the situation and the need to understand who you have facing you and to understand that these people have experienced different things. I'd like to come back to the first point, which is to qualify the situation. I'm talking about movement rather than migration, because we've used migration as a catch-all term to avoid speaking of refugees, for example. So, and I think that this is a good moment to make the difference today on this panel, because when you are a refugee, you have a certain number of rights and expectations and needs to respond to vulnerability. So it is very important to make this difference, which has not been done for many people who have moved, perhaps because we have different population profiles. In Ukraine today, we have a large majority of women, children, and old people, because the law prevents men from leaving the country. In Afghanistan, before summer 2021, we had a large majority of men who were of age to find work or economic research. So this profile of the people sometimes contributes to blurring the differences between these two situations, where people are entitled to ask for the status of refugee following persecution or a risk of persecution in which they find themselves, or violence, and this status which is associated with protection. The other element I wanted to underline is that these people, when they cross the border to enter the European Union, I was in Ukraine in April last year. I went into Poland along with the buses of refugees. So I did this journey. I crossed the border with them. When they crossed the border, their journey had already started a certain time before. There are people who are already very vulnerable when they arrived. For example, people, once again, when I crossed the border, are people who had sometimes left their homes a dozen days earlier, who had spent weeks in shelters, no, who were told they had to get a bus and then didn't find a bus and had to get in a car. The Ukrainians did this very well during the first phase of the evacuation. And we have people who arrived with a story. They had seen violence, and when they crossed the border, they did so with rights, as I have already said, but was also with strong need for protection. I was speaking about the fact we have a majority of women, children and old people who are crossing the borders. That means for the countries receiving them that you need a certain number of police in the stations. You need unaccompanied children to be supported. You need mechanisms to respond to the specific needs in terms of sexual violence, in terms of sexual abuse. You need to be able, it's very complicated, to provide medical services for moving populations because people did not remain on the border themselves. But these people had specific needs. We could speak about this for quite a while, but I think that the message for people working in the field is to have, particularly in border zones like this at risk, to have a clear understanding of who could arrive, what they have lived, to be able to then come with sufficient capacity to respond to the needs for protection which these people are entitled to ask for and to expect. Maybe we'll be able to discuss this later, but this derives from the question of support itself and the coordination between support players and other questions which we can then also anticipate. We've already spoken about this, and I'm not going to stop listening to you. It's very interesting because you are bringing much more information which sometimes we eliminate. And the question which you raise on the different typologies, the different needs, different statuses, we need to define a migrant as a citizen of a country, a republic, who moves from one country to move to France, Italy, or somewhere else. But there is a definition which has been made negative, even amongst the kindest people. As you have said, it's not a problem, but in fact, it's easy to stigmatize people through a definition. You call us out on more important questions if we want to answer these different typologies of people. We need to be able to understand what they have experienced, the different journeys, depending on where they have come from, who they are, what their needs are. So what we will see on the Russian border is not going to be the same thing as we see on the Calais border, for example. And public action, like a machine, calls out at local, European and national levels to understand how to answer the questions of migrants who are not a population, but very different profiles who require us to ask questions about the way we act. I'm summarizing, but that's what strikes me most. So now I cannot. My colleague here, but you have been in the field, concrete terms, and you were telling me earlier that there are situations with border towns which are left to themselves in terms of this question, in terms of this presence. There are names which come out. We talk about Calais. We no longer think about Coluche, the French comedian, but we think about questions of migration. This is, I'm thinking of something, an old joke myself, but we're thinking about an element which makes the question of Calais negative. We talk about Lampedusa in Italy. We make this concept negative as a point. So what about these towns, these frontier towns? I know that you have a very specific opinion about this. Thank you very much. Thank you to the entire team for organizing this forum and to all the speakers on this panel. Indeed, I went to Calais recently, and since going there, along with people who were, in quotes, used to difficult situations, Briançon, Nice, and so on, I'm no longer quite the same. And I think you should all go to Calais today to understand how much we are in an impasse as a society, faced with a problem that we have built and which is following us beyond what we can think, because we are using public money to destroy the tents of people seeking refuge every 40 hours, 48 hours. Their things are stolen, roadblocks are put to block their access to camps where people bring to support them, to bring them food to eat, where they can sit down to eat, so they can be a little bit like they are at home, where rather than just eating standing up in front of a lorry. And if they can no longer, if people supporting them can no longer park close to where they are living, everything is done so they park further away so that the local police can then give them a parking ticket. This is state police, so it is our state police, the gendarmes, the border police, a lot of them, there are more and more of them in Calais. In fact, they cost a lot of money. So the money spent by the state to dissuade these people could be used for other things, because we have to also know that this money is useless, because 100% of the people who are in Calais will not be in Calais in 2 years' time. Either they will be dead, they will have died during the crossing, or they will have crossed successfully, or those who are entitled to asylum will have asked for it and will be granted it. So we have a transitory migration of people who are seeking refuge. And what has struck me today, there are two things, is the fact that we have spoken a lot about citizenship, active citizenship. We've spoken about us, them, people on one side of the border or the other of the border. But like us and them could be distilled down to people with an identity card, a French ID card, or an ID card from the other side of the border. But you have people who live in your towns who can vote at a European level today if they are European, but who are Spanish, who live in Briançon, for example, are Dutch, live in Calais, and so on. So the question today is to build another type of citizenship. In any case, what I think is essential, if I just have one message to share to you today, because there are lots of MPs in the parliament, is to not leave the question of migration in the hands of the Ministry of the Interior, who is the only person to handle this in France, even though the question of the borders is multi-dimensional. The second message, before I finish, I'm sorry if I am a bit vindictive about this, but I don't think it's wrong given what's happening. What is happening in our ports, which we can see less, although it's the same in Port de la Chapelle. There are many areas in France, in Paris, where the same things happen. What happens? What I need to say is that we are being told about a crisis. What does crisis mean? That means rupture. Garmont, who was not a revolutionary in 1976, already spoke about crisis. He said the crisis is a problem because it's in front of a sort of bowing down before our references, before our skills. We need to think about the crisis together to consider whether this crisis is built out of resilience. But what a crisis does is to call into question the models. It requires us to change, to adapt. It requires us, above all, to question our values and to affirm our values. given that there is a crisis, that there are crises in the plural, we call frequently on this word, which is not necessarily the best word to describe the reality, which is uncertainty, which is a globalization of problems. And we have a definition of crisis which did not exist beforehand. War has always existed, but we have seen them less in the last 10 years. And now we have a terror to see this coming back. Mr. De Costa said it this morning. We are frightened. So we talk about Europe and its external borders, and we vote against Europe with internal borders without realizing that the two are linked. Since we are in a round table on crises, I would like also to modulate this question, or to really be aware of which crises we're speaking about. In 2015, we spoke about the bankruptcy of our migratory policies. We saw that we were faced with a total crisis, but we were just faced with wars, problems, famines, and there will be more of these in the future. And we do not handle them as crises. We will need to build other collective schemes for public action in the long term. And that is the message I wanted to share with you today. Okay, absolutely. And as we said, there was a colleague who said the question of migration, migratory flows is not a question in itself. People have always moved, and now finding to say, you're absolutely right. There is not one reason. We have had different crises. We called them crisis because indeed, as you said, this leaves us like this, a little bit stunned in front of this reflection. And the question of migrants or movement of people who are fleeing a war or for another reason is not fleeing a crisis or a war. People move. They move for all sorts of reasons today. The European region, as you have said, should ask questions about who these citizens are in general. What does being a citizen mean? Because that requires us to reflect on a citizen or a migrant who beforehand was a Romanian who came to Italy and is now just a European citizen who lives in Italy, or vice versa. So there are lots of questions. I think that you have fed petrol to the fire. And if you have any questions in the room, please don't hesitate to ask them, because I know that this is a substantial question, but it is important to allow others to speak. And after considering this at different levels, I think it's very opportune now to have among us these last speakers who will enable us to reaffirm our conversation, because Gabriela Staszkiewicz is a mayor on the Polish border, but she is on the opposite side of Ukraine. What is interesting, as you will hear, is that she, as a mayor, asks questions on the roles of migrants who are passing through, crossing the border, but migrants who stay there as well, migrants who come from Ukraine, people who have arrived in her town because they have arrived in Poland, but migrants coming from another country who arrive in Poland and then just stop. How, as a mayor, after having heard these various positions, do you react? Particularly noting that this is your work every day when you go to your office.
Just thank you for invitation. I've made such a stupid things here with this, but this is really difficult to hear. In Cieszyn is a small town on the border between Czech Republic and Poland. So we are twins town. We have almost the same size of town on the Czech Republic part. And we have not so many migrants normally. This was like people coming from Ukraine, working in our factories, working in our shops, And before war, this was, I think, something about 3, 4, 5% of the inhabitants in Cieszyn. During the first few weeks of the war, this was really a huge number of people coming through the Ukrainian border, but also huge number of people coming through Moldavia, Romania, Slovakia, Hungary, and coming to Cieszyn. Because we are the biggest, let's say, border with good transportation. They were coming also by cars, but also by train, and so for both our towns, this was the huge number in a very short time, and this was the most difficult. And because this was such a wave of migration that nobody could say how many people tomorrow will come to Cieszyn or to any other cities. This was completely unpredictable. So we should, we could be prepared. We were prepared for 100. In some days, this was 500 or even 1,000. And they were moving on their own cars, but they were also transported by our people, so people living in Cieszyn. They were offered the flats for them, so sometimes this was really difficult. In the middle of the night, they were phoning that there is a need for 2 families, and this was mostly ladies with small children or very old people. And we were searching, we were just acting immediately, taking phone, cooperated with by our local government, but also with NGOs and so on, so on. So this was the first moment, and then it started because people doesn't know, there was no really procedure what to do with these people. If they get money, if they should get extra food, or even sometimes the clothes. So we collect everything what we could, even beds. So everything what is needed for the people who are, for example, who has a house, and from one day to another they have 10 people living in this house together. So this was, and still is, really difficult. And the most difficult was that procedure were coming, and this took a long time. People was desperate. Some of them get information, and this was especially on our side of the border, that if somebody came directly from Ukraine to Poland, they will get some support. If not, they will not, because there was 2 types of Ukrainian coming through the border of Moldavia and through the border between Poland and Ukraine. So this was really difficult and tough to explain these people why they are treated differently. They are victims of the war, and they are coming to the country asking for help, and they are treated differently. Fortunately, after a few days, this was changed, but there is still, we are at the front of 1st of June, and 1st of June, the support should be changed, so not anymore the money coming to the people who are who has Ukrainians in their houses. So this is still they are still working on the procedure, and this is not fast enough, I suppose. So this is a crisis for this. This is difficult for this Ukrainian people, and this is difficult for Polish people, especially now when we see this increase inflation and all those things. So this is additional factor which makes people nervous, and this is coming also for such a conflicts and discussion why these people are coming to Poland. We should have more support from European Union and so on. So this is something which we are, let's say, we are learning on the live organism how to do it. And this is for Poland, this is for sure first time such a big problem, and we are trying to do as much as possible, but this is still something like not very.
Oui, I will ask you later about the white book of your local governments. On a deux questions, dont la première, je la rattacherai à la question que vient de.
We have two questions. First, the first question that Mrs. Mayor has brought up, the fear of some regions, some citizens faced with the arrival of certain people, not to just define them as a new problem, but because they represent that. I have a very simple question which says, how do we ensure that these migratory problems do not impact projects such as mobility and the spirit of cooperation between cross-border territories?
Transfrontalière de mobilité, de quelle manière, etc. Vous dites non avec la tête, justement, parce que vous avez un avis.
So you seem to be saying no, and you have an opinion on this, which would be interesting to know, but I think it reflects how the question is perceived. There's a difference between perception and reality. Well, in fact, you gave the answer in your question. If you present it as a problem, then it is a problem. If what is happening in the Basque country, the Basque country says, well, whether we like it or not, it's not whether you're pro or against migration. Territories know this phenomenon. Either migrants arrive and stay, or they are in transit, and that's the case for the Basque country or the border at Monceau in France and Calais when they want to leave Europe, then they're prevented from doing so. And so we need to work together intelligently, sharing information on these issues, and let's take responsibility for this. And normally it's not the responsibility of local authorities. It shouldn't be local budgets that have to cope with these issues. It's national governments. But unfortunately, I think that these migrants and the funds are not distributed in a fair fashion. The migration aid fund, the MIF, 5% of that fund is supposed to go from Europe to the territory. So 5%, which is a modest amount, and the rest has to transit via states. And in Poland, because I went to Warsaw on my way to the Ukraine, and it's true that cities and towns in Poland, and it's Polish citizens who hosted mostly these migrants, and the Polish representatives in Warsaw said that they hadn't received any money from the government, and yet the government had been paid more than 600 million euros from the EU to help with the hosting of Ukrainian migrants. So there is the issue of funding, of course, these migrants, and whether the state looks after this or not. Territories are confronted with a situation, and it's in their interest to manage that situation. And you know the situation in Bayonne and what happened there. And I must say that the Basque country is a member of the association that we created a few years ago to welcome migrants in our territory, which means that if the state is not present, well, you mobilize the resources that you have locally. And of course, it's a heavy burden on local finances. But imagine the alternative is to do nothing. You were talking about Calais. Well, the perception that we have of Calais is lots and lots of migrants arriving there. And so we know what the image is. And we know the phenomenon of marketing, territorial marketing, and this has an impact to assess a town as to whether it is welcoming or not to migrants. But if there is a human approach, if migrants are welcomed, really, and that you don't see these odious camps that you see here and there with different situations, that's true. There are lots of centers in Paris, for example, and it is quite complex. And then, of course, this is a state failure. But Calais, the city of Calais could do much, even without the help of the French government, in order to give migrants more dignity in their living conditions, without even talking about harassment of migrants. And so we need to show solidarity, but certainly territories can cooperate, even if the states are doing nothing. But nevertheless, I don't have any particular position. But in terms of affecting the territorial policies of these cross-border areas, we can't deny that the flux of a certain type of migrants, what we call illegal immigrants that didn't come through the proper channels, say, on the French-Italian border. At some point, there were lots of policemen there who were stopping these migrants. And we suddenly saw at the Franco-Italian border, suddenly new controls emerging. And that hadn't been the case previously. So isn't this the same situation as we had during COVID? We closed down all borders because I'm trying to understand the real issue. At some borders, due to migratory flows, at some point, the authorities said, well, we're going to stop the border, the Franco-Italian border, for instance, to stop people coming through from Italy to France. And of course, this has an impact on the cross-border area on the French side in Menton, because there are increasing controls. You've seen more police presence. So we need to sort of understand this situation. And I'm only trying to understand the phenomenon. Go ahead. Well, the question of this fear of migrants is real. Unfortunately, we can no longer hear the speaker. Their microphone seems to have broken down. Right. Yes. Well, the border areas are a fundamentally paradoxical area, because those areas are there to protect a community. So we wish it to be closed in relation to the outside world. But on the other hand, it means that you can go and discover something else and have opportunities to cross the border. So there's this paradox between protection, security, and openness, discovering other things. And this was defined, in fact, in the 1950s, and this hasn't changed. We'd all like to be able to go on holiday, to go and find what's going on the other side of the border, but we don't often like people from the other side of the border to come and do the same thing in our country. So there is this paradox. So we have to think about things from both points of view. And then to crystallize fear in terms of migrants who are coming to find a refuge, and I don't wish to call them migrants, I've called them exiled people, although they're not all exiled, but in any event, they're people who are looking for a haven, political, economical, or otherwise, but they are human beings. And so we don't need to add to these issues. If you take the TGV from Paris to Oux, then you can take a bus that goes via Montgenèvre to Briançon. That's the quickest way to go to Briançon. And lots of people commute in this way or travel in this way, people who live between Briançon and Paris. And some have said to me, well, I don't wish to do this journey anymore, because when you arrive in Oux, you go up to Montgenèvre, and at night there are children that we wake up and that have to come down for the remaining 5 kilometers, and they can't go by bus because they don't have the necessary papers. So they have to walk across the border, and the conditions can be quite freezing. And so people have said we no longer wish to go this way. I'd rather take the night train, although it takes longer. So I'm affected by this, and it's quite understandable that this sort of situation affects territories. But there are people, of course, who feel very uncomfortable in these situations, and they shouldn't bear the responsibility for this situation. And this is a humanitarian issue. So yes, there is a problem, and the issue of migration poses direct problems to cross-border areas. But as we all said, it's a question of solidarity between territories, solidarity between the cross-border networks, for example, like Ville Accueillante, and also solidarity within the territories. And this is something that I have much worked on. The border is not only at the official border, it's in all territories. And collectively, the people of Briançon are actually looking for an answer, because in Briançon, there was a refuge that was funded by the local authorities, and the local authorities stopped the lease. And then a new refuge was set up via private donations, and it works very well. However, it seems that individuals are forced to take responsibility for this, and it seems that collective authorities are no longer assuming responsibility. So I'm worried about the future. Well, I'd like to highlight, I mean, there are several things that bother me, but one in particular that affects me quite deeply, because we spent years trying to erase borders. We try to forget that in the past there was a border. There are people who were told, well, now we're in the European Union, so borders no longer exist, and living areas have been created in cross-border areas. There are people working in one country and live across the border, that use public services in both countries across the border. So they spend their lives in 2 different states. So after many years of this, to try to erase these borders, well, suddenly this happened during COVID, of course, and now with this issue of migratory flows for those people who are in transit. And of course, you can't control immigration in any events. Whatever you do, if they don't succeed the first time, they'll try and try again. And at some point, of course, they will get where they wish to get to. So everything has been done to try and stop migratory flows. And it's impossible to stop those flows, not in the way it's been done in any event. And we make it as difficult as possible for these living areas. For example, there are certain border posts in the Basque country that have been closed, that were open. So that means that the daily lives of people is much more complicated than it was in the past. Simply in order to counter a migratory flow phenomenon that's very difficult to stop. Well, yes, practically impossible to stop, probably. Go ahead.
Yeah, I wanted to add also that, all of Europe, I think, knows situation last year between Poland and Belarus, and people push back in the Belarus part, and that this had and has still a huge impact on this cross-border region, because they were completely closed and there was no tourism, nobody could enter this. And now, because the Polish government is building the wall across this, along this border, the situation is going, let's say, up, but this is not solving the problem. So I think any walls will solve a problem with migration, and we should start to think how to do it another way. Also, the COVID, when you have, like me, one town just split by the river, and 5 bridges, and all of a sudden you are coming to this place and you see the soldier on your street, and you cannot enter the place which is normally your town. This is horrible, and this really not help anybody and destroy years of integration between our 2 towns, Czech and Polish. And this was really a huge mistake, because it's not secured anything, so not help anything.
J'allais venir vers vous, Monsieur Szydarowski, parce que
I was going to come to you, Mr. Szydarowski, because Mrs. Staszkiewicz has spoken of the Ukrainian refugees issue. I think you want to come back to this. She's also talked about the situation in Belarus, migrants who were in transit, and the question is, could we have more information on Ukrainian migrants? Do you think that the situation will develop? Are we doing something specific? And the question is addressed to you.
Coming back to all the chain of statements here, what we fear about is a negative scenario of something we call fractured territories, or territories that don't matter. This is this public jargon. And the cross-border areas are very much exposed to this sort of development because of many reasons, because of the decisions by the government, by the higher instances, because of the nature of developments. They are, if you put it that way, on the line of facing the phenomena, the trends, the processes, the flows, the interrelations. And they will never escape from that. It's only the matter of how to cope with that, what can be done together. Actually, in Espon, we are trying to provide evidence of this is now happening. Please draw lessons for the future. Please observe, please understand what's going on, because it's going to hit you back if you are not going to understand it and be aware of that and not prepare yourself. And we also did a lot of analysis with our researchers about how the war in Ukraine can escalate in terms of different scenarios. It's going to be a short term or longer term. More refugees, less refugees. And these are only scenarios. We don't know how the situation is going to evolve, but it opens eyes of policymakers that we must prepare ourselves, because it doesn't matter if the indicator on this and that will be -4, -5, or -10. It presents the direction of changes. So in order not to fall down there, I need to prepare my municipality, my region. I need to do it with the citizens, based on the solidarity movement that we've seen so many times now in the recent months. Because people, the citizens, are our capital. And again, I need to repeat, we need to do it with them, not for them. And migrants actually are also human capital. Some of them are going to stay longer in our places. Some are going to go back to where they started their journey from. Some of them are going to move forward. But we need to exploit this capital in the positive sense, because they bring skills, they bring competences, they bring something that maybe has been lacking in our areas, because some of the cross-border areas have been shrinking in terms of population, in terms of resources, in terms even of ideas and innovation capital. And this is how we can look also upon the problem or whatever, the challenge of migrants, of migration.
Thank you. Madame Godefroy, vous vouliez rajouter quelque chose?
Thank you, Madame Godefroy. You wish to add something? Yes. Following what was said about the risk of escalation and preparation, I think that's being better prepared and being more resilient at a local level, working with the civil society and citizens in general, but also with the security forces. All this is essential. In fact, this preparation is never enough. Of course, we don't draw all the lessons necessary from previous crises integrated into future planning at strategic or operational level. And so to come back on the risk of escalation, well, there are various scenarios that we should keep in mind. And the EU and NATO, of course, working on these different scenarios, that the conflict could escalate and continue for a very long time. And the risk, in particular, for border areas such as Poland and the Baltic states. So how can we be more resilient? What appears clearly today is that the level of preparation in case the war escalates in these territories that we're talking about. So the risk is military and political, but it's not really geared towards the protection of ordinary citizens. And then the risk in terms of protection is all the more acute because the concerned territories are territories which host migrants. So there is a double level of stress, to pick up on the term that was used earlier. And there are some states, the Baltic states in particular, since 2014, we're thinking about a concept of total defense. This comes back to what you were saying. How can we prepare for an escalation, including a military escalation, and indeed cyber attacks, info wars, not only at a military level, but also in the sector of education, health, and so with local authorities. And to my knowledge, in a few NATO countries, outside of these border countries, that is something that does not exist today. And it is something that should be thought of in terms of the security and defense policies of the EU. So we have factors here that have multi-stages, but I'm thinking in terms of the protection of civilians. There are countries that are under huge stress, and if there is an escalation of the conflict, so the level of preparation is even more important, and it's certainly insufficient today. And you, the cross-border actors, you have a very significant role to play. Well, the question of escalation, of course, is something that highlights the difference in terms of preparation of different countries, but also the migratory issue is looked at differently between different countries. It can lead to individual acts by states, as opposed to taking or adopting collective measures. And there's a lack of coordination also. And if there is an escalation, it's not going to concern only a couple of Baltic states, but it could have a tremendous impact on the whole of Europe. And that's a different issue, but it leads us to reflect again on cross-border territories as laboratories. And the Polish case is interesting because they wrote a white book on the migratory issue. And this was carried out by the local authorities. And we were talking about this when we talked about the way Belarus people were treated. So this led to the publishing of a white book on this issue. So I would like to come back to you, after listening to Madame Szaszanowicz on this issue, because the Basque country is also a laboratory, because we're talking about. But first of all, Madame Staszkiewicz.
Yes, recently at the beginning of May, we met in Wrocław on the this was the invitation of the president of Wrocław city. We met with NGOs, with government, we met with municipality, CIS, mayors, presidents of big towns, because it's mostly concerned also big towns in Poland. There is the most the biggest number of refugees, and we discuss in this was big round table again in Poland, and we discuss about the different topics, so education, legal changes, social care, hospitals, so healthcare, work places for these people, for those people. So we had conclude this in the white book, and this white book was also given to our government to at least to discuss, to start a discussion how to prepare for longer term activities together, because it should be common discussion first, and common I think procedures how to deal in the future with such a things, and I think this future is coming. So because part of these people are not coming back will not coming back soon back to Ukraine. So we need to be prepared with the flats, with workplaces, with schools, with higher education level, with all those things for the next few months. So I think this is good start, and we should discuss this and think over how to do it, how to implement this into life.
Thank you. Madame Elorza.
Prête. Oui, je voulais partager.
I wish to share two initiatives with you that we set up in the Basque country, because I spoke of the joint declaration with Iparralde, with the French Basque country. But this is part of a larger picture. In December 2018, we signed the social pact for migration in the Basque country. And what we wish is to ensure that the public sector and the public sector would come together around a certain set of principles and values and commitments. And when I speak of principles, I'm talking about the principle of pluralism. Diversity is considered to be a value. It's not a risk. It's something that adds. The principle of solidarity, also the value of respecting the dignity of others. And in terms of commitments, well, it's about improving the hosting of migrants who arrive. And whether we're talking about migrants or unaccompanied minors or people just generally who need protection, and it might well be for people who might be in transit towards another country, so they are with us only for a few days. So this agreement from December 2018, supported by all parties within the Basque Parliament, or who were in the Basque Parliament at the time, of course, in 2018. But now, of course, we have the extreme right to contend with. I don't know what they would have done then. But in any event, all Basque institutions signed up to this pact, to the government, local governments, municipalities, local authorities, but the universities as well, the social sector. And the idea is that there is in fact a triple objective in this agreement. First of all, there is an ethic dimension. We talk about people, human beings who have their rights, human rights. And also, we need to take into account of prevention. We need to stop xenophobia, and certainly we should stop any xenophobic language or attitudes that's become ingrained in our society. And the third pillar is a more practical issue. And here I agree with Mr. Szydarowski, because in the end, migratory flows should be considered as progress. And so these people need to be placed in a wider context. And besides this, I would mention another initiative that we set up. And the idea is to try and open new ways of doing things. And it's an initiative experience by what happened in Quebec in Canada. And since 2019, in the Basque country, it's a pilot project that we've developed with the High Commission of the United Nations for Refugees, agreed with the Spanish government and leaders of the Basque region. And we also work with civil society. And the idea of this project, we've hosted about 30 Syrian people who were in refugee camps in Jordan. These people belong to 5 families. They came to us, they live with us. And in fact, there were volunteers who, so it's civil society that sponsors the hosting and the integration of these people. And it is up to these volunteers to provide funds, 10,000 euros, and housing. And it's up to us in the Basque government to guarantee a minimum revenue, monthly revenue for these families, whatever their administrative status. And also we finance the recruiting of social workers and or educators so that these might work with the volunteers to help integrate these families. And it started in 2019. As I said, it's a pilot project. And I have to say that the project is going well. We are satisfied. And the idea is that the United Nations might well be able to promote similar initiatives in other regions or countries, and that we should be able to help those people who really need our protection and need to escape all the human trafficking networks that exist in Europe.
Thank you. 2 cases where you can see concrete actions, but there are other cases where territories often show better than ever a certain capacity to respond and set up projects. But I think that this subject, it would be good to have an interaction with the people in the room, because this subject, you have demonstrated it through the questions that we have received through the internet, but sometimes silence demonstrates a great deal of concentration, but we need to be able to speak and we need to bring out doubts, comments. So please raise your hand and show yourselves if there is somebody in the room, if you have any comments or questions on this topic, which does have an impact on cross-border regions, because you are the first to experience this type of phenomenon. I do not see much with this spotlight in my eyes, but if anybody in the room raises their hand, I would like to be told. If you could hand over to them. In fact, you're not here for a cross-border. Okay, yes. Yes, hello. I'm from Mott. I'm not going to ask a question. I wasn't going to ask a question, but I'd like to ask it anyway. I'm not a specialist in these questions like you, but I would like to ask a question, a bit of a simple question, if to understand if we would be better placed to receive these questions, people in cross-border areas tomorrow, we would be the best ambassadors for these cross-border areas, because I'm a son of Italian immigrants. I am from Lorraine. My partner is the granddaughter of Italian and Polish migrants. I think the people who have the best feeling of belonging to France, who I've ever known, was my Italian grandfather, because he was welcomed by France at a time of Mussolini was in power in Italy. And I would like to know, if we welcome these people to our border areas, would that not also be to make them ambassadors for our cross-border areas? I like that. Personally, I like that. How does that talk to you, this story? Does that make you, what does that bring to mind? Is that possible? Thank you, Aurélien. First of all, I am going to answer pessimistically and then optimistically. Were a lot of Jews who stood up during the First World War, who joined the French army in the First World War, in the Second one as well, and who were gassed like the others, despite being France and elsewhere in the world. So it's not always easy to carry this welcome over several generations. The French currently are afraid, or we are afraid. I include myself in that because I am French, and there are less frightened by people who are arriving than those who are already here. These are long-term stories. So today, I think we are taking decisions which will commit future generations. And I would like to now switch to a more positive answer. In other words, what we say, and I think that we say it often even more in border areas. These are fragile areas, often poor areas. So we would ask why we put so much money into these people arriving when we have our own poor people. We have this deindustrialization and things like that. We saw with COVID that when there is a public problem, we could put the resources in place to respond to this. So yes, indeed, we could be ambassadors if we managed to uncouple the problem of people arriving and to put it into a social cultural context which concerns the territories as a whole. Please.
For sure we can. I'm from the region where there was before First World War, there was Jewish, Czech, Polish, people from Austria, Russian, so multi-culti. And there was, also there was region where the lot of Lutherans were living, so there was also different religion, which is not so typical for Polish regions. So for us, this is really not a problem to take responsibility to take these people to our houses and to host them. We need of course, some regulations and support to avoid situation that somebody will say, yeah, for our people, we don't have such a condition and you are offering this to somebody else who is just coming. We don't know if he stays longer term and so on and so on. I also think that this is for us really the chance to have new people in the town. new energy, especially that this is ladies with small children. So for the town where the let's say the seniors are almost 30%, so this is really crucial. So if 5% of these people will stay in our towns, we will be really happy, and this is really makes a difference now already. When we see these people, we see these children in the kindergarten, in the schools, how they behave, how our children behave, and how they learn fast languages, both sides. So this is fantastic. And in the house of my, in neighborhood, in the house of my brother, we have 2 ladies, 2 sisters with 3 children, and they always says that nobody gives them such an open heart like we. So I think this is all.
Thank you very much. And s'il y a des autres questions, moi je pense que...
if there are other questions, I think that we are finishing on a very positive point. The question of migrants and who are a resource where, and if flows are slowed down for different reasons, we have the opportunity to have a new... It's not a bad thing to represent this as a resource, because it's human, but it is a resource too. So cross-border areas, ambassadors, but this resource can bring even more. I think that finishing this panel on a positive point, if there are no further questions in the room, I don't know if there are any more. I cannot see any hands. I can't actually see anything at all. So I think that we need to thank our 6 guests for covering this question. So let's thank them. They've done this very well. Thank you very much. Thank you.